Well, as we note in the book of Esther, this is a book where we can see that it's not comprised of very explicit heroes. We've mentioned this is a lot like Samson, a man who very much is driven by his own passions and sort of thinks about the Lord in the process. It's not first, let's think about the Lord and then think about how to take our passions and bring them in line with what's consistent with God. And in Esther, we find that on the one hand, we could say, well, if the tension in the narrative or the tension in the story is whether or not God just wants to maintain order in this particular place, and whether or not this empire is going to have a queen to be as a replacement for Vashti, well, then we see there's a great story. But when we get to a deeper level of the story, which clearly this book does not end in chapter 2, but it continues. There's a deeper story that's going on here as the Lord is communicating the nature of his redemption. And one of the things in the Lord's redemption we must always remember is when the Lord comes to Abram in Genesis 15, he says, Abram, I am your shield and defender. To hear that is a reminder that the Lord is going to preserve his people no matter the circumstances. His people will be protected and preserved by his own promise in Genesis 15. This is where we come to the book of Esther and we find the story and say, what's going on? The Lord said to Abraham, I am a shield and defender. This is who I am. And now we come to the book of Esther and it seems like everything is lost. Everything is in turmoil. And so how can the Lord defend his people? And on the one hand, the person who has the most influence, Queen Esther, maintains her silence. Mordecai, we're questionable. Is he upset as to human pride? Is he upset because the Lord's being challenged? I mean, we don't really know. And we can say, how is it that the Lord is going to protect his people? Has the Lord forsaken his redemptive promise that he's no longer going to protect his people when they're in a foreign land? Or maybe they're just too far from his protection. What do we do with this? Well, as we consider it, we'll see first a potential promotion that's given or perhaps offered to Mordecai. It's potential. We see, secondly, the old grudge that manifests itself and comes to light. And then we're reminded of history's tragic reversal. And so let's begin with a potential promotion. We notice the setting of the story in Esther 2, verse 19. The young maidens are gathered again and paraded through the city. Commentators are kind of puzzled as to what exactly is going on here because the king has already chosen his queen with Esther after the shameful contest. And we find that the probable thing that's going on here is, again, the king parading the wealth and majesty of the kingdom and allowing the young maidens to go through the city for everyone basically to marvel at the power and prestige of this kingdom and who this king is. Now, there's kind of a subtlety there, because maybe for those in authority, this might be okay. But for those who really are the peasants, this is a tragic thing. And it's something that reminds them of something else. This parade reminds them they don't own anything. Their own family, their own children, they don't own it. If you study the history of Xerxes, what he did to young boys and how he made those young boys mandatory eunuchs for his harem, you can go through the atrocities of this kingdom. And so this parading of the young maidens, we shouldn't see this as just something that's this wonderful return of these young ladies to their apartments. This is a king once again saying to the kingdom, I own you. You cross me, I own you. And so it's something in the story in verse 19 that should put us a little bit in an uneasy place, to make us a little uncomfortable in saying, God's people aren't safe here. This guy sees himself as King of Kings, Lord of Lords, right? And when we do the pun with my head, Ash, right? My head, that for him, he can think I'm the head of all. But we said to Israel, to God, he's a headache. He's a pain. He's a nuisance. And that's what's intended to be communicated here in verse 19. Now we have this other tragic note here. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people. Verse 19. And again, it's Esther, not Hadassah, not the remnant, not the myrtle tree, not the humble remnant that the Lord preserves, but Esther, star. The goddess of fertility is her name that's called to our attention. Is that her place? To simply advance this kingdom in the line of this pagan king? Is that really where she's going to find her contentment? Probably not. But she probably sees this as the only way to preserve life. Or is she going to be one who's going to stand up and be the divine appointment of God, right? As remember we said, the Persians see the stars as a symbol of God's divine appointment. Will she be the one where she will step up and be a means that God will use to preserve his people? We don't know. At this point, we're left saying, where is she in this status? Where is she in terms of her God? But we hear of Mordecai now, and Mordecai, remember, he's one associated with Marduk, the god of the kings, the patron of the kings. So we wonder, is Mordecai one who's going to show his allegiance to this king, or his allegiance to the true God? Again, the book of Daniel, they have Persian names, but it's always a Hebrew name that's called to our attention, so we never question their alliance. Well, as Haman is at the gates, he hears of this plot to kill the king. And we don't know exactly how he's heard of this plot, but it came to him. He may have overheard a plot. Somebody may have reported to him, as there's records in the Persians where Greeks would have this role as well, where you would have foreigners who would be part of the secret police. Mordecai being associated with the kingly royalty or royal line of Israel. It seemed that he's probably one trusted of the king, has such an appointment that he's part of the royal police. And so it would make sense that somebody would tell him, hey, there's this plot to kill the king that's going on here. You should know about it. Now, the thing to note about this society as Esther keeps her name secret, her identity secret. We think of America being this pluralistic culture. We say, how does the church minister in a pluralistic culture? Well, Persia was also a pluralistic culture. There are a lot of people, a lot of nationalities, a lot of different languages, a lot of cultures, right? And Cyrus's mindset when he was conquering the world, his mindset was keep the people happy, they'll pay their taxes, right? If you keep the people happy, they'll pay their taxes and say, hey, we don't really like the Persian Empire, but we do get some things in return. We have some peace. We'll pay the taxes. So for Cyrus, brilliant diplomat, keep the people happy, you get your taxes. Xerxes was a little more impulsive and not as predictable, if you will. So you can kind of understand where they keep their name secret, but also in terms of the culture, people probably wouldn't look down on them, which is one of those things where you have this ominous sense of, why is Esther really being so secretive? And is Mordecai going to stay secret? Well, we don't know at this point. But what we do know is that he goes and he reports this to the king. So we have this sort of lingering thing in the background. And as he reports it to Esther, Esther is going to report it to the king. Now, the hopes of this, and you have to understand again, the subtlety of this, the expectation is if you report things like this to the king will handsomely reward you. So Mordecai is not someone who's 100% innocent here. So his expectation is, I tell the king, Esther gets promoted because obviously she's trustworthy. I'm going to get some sort of a handsome reward because I'm the one to save the king's life. This is what the kings do. This is what's great about them. Well, we never read about that. And so we wonder, is this part of why he's so upset when he has a competitor placed in the position that he probably thinks he deserves? Well, we don't know. But what we do know is we're reminded of the harshness of this empire. Not only are the young maidens paraded through the city, a reminder you don't know anything, but the ESV or our English translations clean up the consequence in verse 23. It says they're hanged on the gallows. We think of that as something that's, I guess you could say, as humane of an execution as could be, if you're going to say it's humane. But whatever the case, this execution that transpires is not a quick crucifixion. To keep it G-rated for the pulpit, basically, this is something where you set someone on a pole and you let the pole slowly kill them. This is something that makes crucifixion look like something that is humane and kind. And we'll just leave it at that. It is a miserable death. But it's a death that's intended to say to the empire, I own your kids. You cross me. This is how you die. So this is something at the beginning and ending of this is not very nice. You're recognizing you do not want to cross this king. And now we have a man who has actually told the king of someone who's going to kill him, and there's no mention of his reward. So we're saying, okay, so this king is harsh, this king is brutal, and this king doesn't even reward those who preserve his life. So you can understand. When you get to this situation, you say, all right, what do we have? We have Esther, who's quiet. She's led by men. She obeys Mordecai. She does what they tell him. She may have some diplomacy skills as she's earned Haggai's attention and his mentoring. But whatever the case, we don't really know where she is. Still quiet, still following the king's orders and following Mordecai's orders. Mordecai turning someone over in his death or this conspiracy to kill the king, nothing happens. And so you can understand there's some tension here. There's some tension going on here. And the reality is, when I look at this book, I would see this as a conclusion to Act 1. I would see Esther as a 3-act play, much like we have today. So the conclusion of Act 1, it's resolved. The empire's in control. The king rules over all, and everyone's going to serve him. So we move on to Act 2. This is where we get into the substance of this book, where we find this old grudge that emerges. There's a new character that enters the scene. His name is Haman, Haman the Agagite. We say, well, why is that important? What does this matter? We know that Mordecai does not like him. Now, with Mordecai not liking this man, there's something else going on here. And we say, well, is it because he's jealous that he didn't get a promotion? Is he upset that he didn't get an award from the king? Why is he so angry? Well, the subtlety of the text, again, the book of Esther, there's a subtlety that's going on. The thing that we're told is who this man is Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, right? So you say, well, what does that mean? Well, his actual father, we don't know a whole lot about him, but the Agagite, that's the thing that's emphasized. That's what's put up there right for us to understand. There is a story here, a story that's significant. It goes back to Exodus chapter 17. In Exodus 17, the promise was made that the Israelites, when they went into the land in their unique mandate to take the land and to build and project heaven on earth in Canaan, they were to exterminate this particular king. He was rebellious. He was evil. This is what they were to do in their unique time. Now, this moment fell to Saul. We have a record of this in 1 Samuel 15. And in 1 Samuel 15, Saul has the opportunity to kill Amalek, the king that's associated with the Agagites. And he was supposed to carry out the full orders of God, and he failed to kill this king. In fact, he just plundered him, made a sacrifice, and did it all in his own strength. Well, this king thinks he's safe. Samuel meets with Saul, and he says to Saul, "What are you doing? This is a sworn enemy of Israel. The Lord has said that this king will not prosper and will not prevail. What are you doing?" Well, Saul said, "Wow, I really messed up. I made a mistake." And the narrative recounts where Amalek comes running out and he thinks everything's fine and he thinks that he's good and there's no problem at all of what's going on. And he's excited to meet with Samuel, or Agag, is excited to meet with Samuel. And he thinks everything's fine. And then Samuel recalls for him the very promise that the Lord has made against the Amalekites, and how Agag is part of this clan. And Samuel then carries out the order of God and slaughters him with a sword. Saul is removed as king at that moment. And this happens at Gilgal, a place of being cut off, right? A place where Israel is supposed to be consecrated to God, in a place where Saul is cut off, at least not literally, but his lineage in terms of being a king is cut off. And you have there Agag is cut down and cut off and completely circumcised, which is what this means. And so that's the backdrop of what's going on here. When we understand Mordecai is a relative of Saul, you say, well, is this a personal vendetta? Is it because he's identified with Saul? Well, he doesn't say he's necessarily identified with Saul, but that he's identified as a Jew. And so now whatever happens, whatever he's been pushed to do or reveal, he's told the other individuals who serve with him, again, it's probably some sort of an international police force, if you will, in the sense that you have different people from different nations who would be able to report on potential unrest in the kingdom. And they're telling him, if you have a brain, you bow to Haman. This guy is not someone you want to cross. So when he walks in, just swallow your pride, bow down. I don't understand why you're not bowing to this man. The king said we're supposed to bow to him. We know this king is severe, and we've just heard it, right? We heard it to the conclusion of Acts 1. He parades the young maidens around the city saying, you don't own anything. And he executes people in a very cold, heartless way publicly. This is not a king you want to cross. So they're saying to Mordecai, it's a lot easier if you just swallow your pride and bow down to this man and you let it go. Mordecai won't let it go. And Mordecai, somewhere along the lines, tells him that he's Jewish. And so this tells us, at least when push comes to shove, there's something going on that Mordecai has a consciousness. And a consciousness that this man Haman is an enemy of Israel. And it's an important point that's going on when we understand that the flow of covenant history. This kingly line was not to endure. And it becomes a model, a type, a picture of the final judgment. And so the very credibility of God is on the line here. The fact that this man continues tells us that the Lord did not carry out his final judgment. This sets a stage. Can God protect his people? We don't know if Mordecai is confident of this. We don't know if this is just pride. We don't know if this is a reaction because of what's happened to Saul. We don't know if it's because he's a Jew and he's a follower of Yahweh. We don't fully know Mordecai's thinking, but he's revealed he's a Jew. Well, as this happens, we find that these individuals tell Haman, hey, you better watch this Mordecai guy. Observe him. He's not bowing down to you. He's not paying respect. Observe him. And so we find that sure enough, notices that this guy Mordecai is not paying his reverence to Haman. So Haman goes and he recognizes it's probably not a good idea for him just to slaughter someone that looks rather petty, looks rather small. And so he comes up with a better plan that doesn't look as petty, which also tells us how this king can be very severe and make decrees, but can also be easily manipulated. Because Haman comes up with a plan. Now we find that there's this potential reversal in history. And the reversal is this. The Lord said that the Amalekites, King Agag, is not going to prevail. But here we find a descendant who's reversing all this. He's actually cast lots, is what it tells us. Basically, you're looking at, or what is described here when he casts pur. It's sort of like a clay die or clay dice. It could be one or two. And what he's trying to figure out, and this is really concerning to me, I guess I shouldn't chuckle, but it's just the irony is just unbelievable. He's casting lots not to discern whether or not his plan is correct or honorable. He's not discerning that. The plan's good, right? That's his mindset. The plan's good. But he wants to figure out the timetable of carrying out his plan. It seems to me the wise thing to do would be to start with, is this a good plan? Is this honorable? Is this something that I should pursue? Like that should be the first question. Oh no, he's not asking that. This is what he wants to do. The plan is how long? This sets the tension in the narrative because it sets a time frame of about 11 months from the time he meets the king to the time of the extermination or genocide of the Jews. It's 11 months. So this is telling us if God's going to protect his people and fulfill his promise and say that the seed of the serpent's not going to rise above the seed of the woman, he better act. He's got 11 months to do so. You may say, well, how urgent is it? Well, we find what he does when he meets with the king. Haman has this private, it seems, conference with the king. And you can see how deceivers work. He starts with a very true statement. There's a people scattered throughout the empire. That's true. There's a lot of people scattered throughout the empire, a lot of nationalities scattered throughout the empire. That's a true statement. Nothing deceptive there. That's absolutely true. The king would say, yes, that's true. There's a lot of people, a lot of nations, a lot of nationalities, which is emphasized where each nationality receives these decrees in their own language. But now he goes on to say, well, these people, they have different laws, which tells us these are not compliant people. They're not like Cyrus said. They're not people who are just going to go to the land and live peacefully. No. These are people that have their own laws. In other words, these are not submissive people. These are people that think for themselves, people who act for themselves, people who are going to be a problem for the king. In other words, it's not that I don't like these people. These people are a problem for you. I'm thinking of you, right? I mean, it just makes you want to vomit how deceptive this is. But that's what he's doing. Coming to the king, hey, I'm thinking of you. These people think for themselves. They're going to be a problem people. It's Jewish people. And they're not people you want in your kingdom. And then he goes on to say, the way we really need to understand is that they're going to make their own laws. And they're not going to follow the king's laws. They're not going to follow the king's decrees. Think about what the king did to Vashti. When he made an unreasonable request and he flew off the handle. What do you think he's going to do to a potential international rebellion? People who rule by their own rules and don't follow the king's decrees. I mean, you can just understand the king's blood starting to boil. Oh, we can't have this in our empire. Who's going up on the gallows? Who's going to go up and be put on a stick, if you will? Who's next? Let's do it, right? So the king is going to be 100% on board with this. Now, one of the problems you're going to have if you do a genocide, right? I mean, not only the conscience problem, not only destroying the image of God, not only other complications ethically, but in terms of running an empire, the main problem you're going to have is you're going to potentially lose tax dollars. And that's what we see drives this empire in a tragic way. Haman has a solution to that. The number that he presents, the 10,000 talents of silver, the people estimate this is about 60% of the tax revenue. So Haman's basically saying to the king, listen, I understand you're going to have the stress. You have these people that are productive, paying taxes. I'm going to take care of that stress too. I'm actually going to make this profitable for you. Not only are you going to lose some of their tax dollars, I understand you're stressed about that. I'm going to make sure that tax revenue is recovered and multiplied. I'm going to make sure that you are made more than whole if you follow this plan. And the tragedy is the king's just like, oh, okay. Like, well, once he hears that, it's like, oh, we're good. Let's run with it. And then notice what the king does. He takes off his signet ring. Now, we might wonder, why is that so significant? This is a big deal. You see, each king would have his own ring that only the king would possess. And there would be a little imprint or pattern that would be on that ring that would be unique to the king. No one else would have this. You don't want to try and even counterfeit this, because you'll be in a world of trouble. If you see what he's done to other people, you wouldn't even try. Plus, word would get out, because the person that made the ring would probably tell the king or report you for even inquiring about it. But what this ring would do is you would make a decree. You'd roll up the decree in a scroll. You'd put wax over the roll to communicate that it's sealed, or we could say in an envelope, you put wax over it. The king would then take his ring and press his ring into the hot wax and leave that imprint. And the point of that is to say, this comes with the authority of the king, and this message has not been tampered with. This message is authentic. And so when the king takes off his ring, he's saying Haman has full power of attorney. It means whatever Haman decrees or writes or sends to the empire, it's as if the king has sent it. So he's essentially transferring his power to Haman. Whatever decree you make is as if I have made the decree. I mean, this is a level of trust that is in the level of folly and foolishness, because you do not know what this man's going to do. But as the king gives him the signet ring, it means Haman can make this decree. Now, as he makes this decree, we find something about this decree. That not only are the Jews to be annihilated, to be destroyed, again, the very promise that the Lord has made as modeled with the Amalekites, but ultimately the seed of the serpent to be put down and destroyed is being applied to the Lord's people. And as it's applied to the Lord's people, there's a motivation. And this is a trick that Rome used as well. Basically, if you sell out your neighbor, you get to plunder your neighbor. So if you have a Jewish neighbor, has a very nice house, very nice life, and you look at his wealth, you report that individual to the empire, all that's yours. So is this a little motivating for people in the community to start ratting out their neighbors? Well, yeah, especially if your neighbor's going to die and can avenge you for what you've done. I mean, you look at this and say, wow, this is pretty cold. This is pretty nasty. And that's the reality of what Haman puts out there. All because a Jewish individual would not pay him homage. That's not even due him. That's due to the Lord. And we find at least there's some hope in the conclusion of this story, that the city is in confusion, which tells us that while Haman and the king have this alliance and they're good with it, the city itself is confused as to why they're doing this. Why are we going to try and kill all these people? What's the point of it? Why would we rat out our neighbors? But the reality is it leads us to a point where we say, can God protect his people? The Lord said at the exit of Eden, I will triumph over the serpent. Well, in Esther 3, the serpent has the upper hand. The serpent has passed a decree that God's covenant people will be destroyed. That's a decree. They will be destroyed. And it leaves us with an issue of how do we know that the Lord is going to be with his people? We wonder, Esther still maintains secret identity. Is she just the king's jewelry? Is she just the one to be paraded around the empire as the king has done what he desired? Or is she going to be the divine appointment? Is she going to rise up? Is the Lord going to use her? In all honesty, we don't really know about what the Lord's doing in the midst of his people. But when we think about this decree and how it goes forth, the real issue is we're invited to battle with, does man's decree take over the Lord's decrees? Can man usurp what God has set in place? Well, the reality is there is something we can see as hope. Because we go back and we think who God is. Who is God? God is one who is a shield and defender. God will protect his people. He still has 11 months. What is more, we also find out, even as Mordecai might be questionable and we don't know fully where Mordecai is, at least he doesn't say, as the text communicates, I'm a descendant of Saul. So this isn't just pride. It isn't just your daddy upset my daddy and I'm going to finish this. It's more than that. With his identity of saying, I'm a Jew. I'm an individual as a follower of Yahweh. At least that's the hope we have here, that the Lord is still at work in the midst of this. And so we can be assured that even as the Lord remains silent, he is going to work. His promises do not fall flat. And one of the important things I would say in the book of Esther is that something that really needs to encourage us. Because if God can work in the context of his B team and be triumphant, as we know the ending of this book, how much more is God going to work in the midst of us as we cling to him, as we seek to please him? Because the reality is, what is our mindset as we're reading this? You need to send in SEAL Team 6, right? You need to send in the elite fighters and take care of this. And the Lord is actually turning to us and saying, remember when I told you not to trust the war horse? Remember when I told you not to trust in what your eyes could see? Remember how I told you to trust in me? The book of Esther is assuring us that when God is silent, he is still at work. When God is not vocal, he is still speaking and doing his action. And the Lord will preserve his people. And we need to put our trust, our confidence, and our identity in our Redeemer. Because while there is this decree that happens, we're going to find the great irony of the book. Haman will not carry out his genocide. But the Lord, through the unlikely people, will carry out what he said he would do. Despite Saul and despite others, the Lord will triumph over the serpent seed. Let us find our identity in Christ and our peace in our Redeemer. That as he overcomes, and so often we may think he's not going to succeed going to the cross, but that's the means of victory. Because the cross ends in resurrection and ascension. And in that identity, we have life. As Christ has been raised from the dead, let us trust and believe that the Lord's eternal decree will never be annulled. He is the one who enforces it and acts it and brings it to pass. Amen. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We're Belgrade URC, a Reformed Bible-believing church in the Gallatin Valley in Belgrade, Montana. We meet Sundays at 10 a.m. and 6 p.m., and we love to see you worshiping and fellowshipping with us each Sunday. Learn more about our church at belgradeurc.com, where you can subscribe to our podcasts and use our sermon archive. Until we meet again, may the Lord's blessing and peace be upon you.